Hello, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.4 Abyss guide. As usual, we'll only be going through floor 12 of the current Spiral Abyss in 5.4. We'll be going through every single tip I can think of to beat these chambers, from the enemies that you'll be facing to the characters you should be taking. Thanks a lot everybody for the incredible support last video, and welcome if you're new. As always, if you have any thoughts, tips or advice, feel free to put them in the comments below, and any really important comments that I've missed out in the video will be pinned in the comments section. If you have any questions about my builds, or any really specific questions, the best place to ask those is either on my Twitch or in my Discord server. Before we even get into anything about the Abyss Blessing or the Leyline Disorders, there's a point that I really need to prove at the start of this video, which is that if you've ever really wanted to 36-star Abyss, now is the time. As you'll find out when we go through the chambers later, this is one of the easiest Abysses we've had in a really long while. One, because we have a standard banner character featured on a limited banner, and they usually tailor the Abyss to the featured characters, and so because it's a standard banner character, they're usually weaker, this Abyss is just generally easier. Secondly, this Abyss has a lot less specific restrictions compared to normal Abysses. There's no cryo check, there's no Papilla ward, it's very simple to complete. Even further than that, one side is completely dedicated to single target, whereas the other side is completely dedicated to multi-target, meaning a vast array of characters are able to compete in this Abyss that usually wouldn't be able to. Even though we do have the highest HP we've ever had for chambers 2 and 3, this is mainly because of the multi-target nature, meaning you're often able to hit multiple enemies with abilities at once, and secondly, it's a bit deceptive because wards and elemental shields, even really high resistances, aren't factored into HP difficulty calculations. So now we've got a bit more determination, let's get into the Abyss Blessings. Here, just like last Abyss, we have another trigger of damage originating from your character every 3 seconds. This time, instead of pyro reactions, it's based upon healing, and each time it does about 14,000 true damage. Xianyun, Chevra, Siegeween, or characters that self-heal continuously like Wriothesley make great use of the Abyss Blessing, whereas big single instance healers like Mika aren't quite as effective. There's notes for some specific characters that are quite relevant here. First of all, that there's one character, Arlecchino, who notoriously can't receive healing. This means if you're using her as your active character, and only the active character receives healing, this buff won't trigger at all. Though just to be a bit confusing, to clarify, if you're using C6 Cheverus, her C6 requires the character to get healed by her ability to gain the buff, but Arlecchino just gains this anyway, so this is coded slightly differently. On top of that, overhealing does count as healing, so you don't have to worry about being low health to get the most of this Abyss Blessing. Another specific character that's worth mentioning that you wouldn't really consider as a healer is Furina. This is because of her first Ascension passive. What it does is whenever a character on your team receives healing above their max HP, so they get overhealed, and the healing is not coming from Furina herself, then for the next 4 seconds, every 2 seconds, Furina will contribute healing to all of your party members for a small amount. This means that she's amazing for triggering this buff if you have healing in your team, which you should do with a Furina team. Lastly, the amount of damage it does isn't affected by the amount of healing you do, meaning you only need a tiny amount to proc it. This means if you equip any Catalyst character with a weapon like Prototype Amber, when you burst, you get small amounts of healing for your whole party over a duration, it will proc it consistently. But as always with these things, use them if you can, but don't feel forced to. Right, let's take a look at the Leyline Disorders, because they're also back. The first one, which is quite obviously designed for Mizuki, is 600% swirl damage. Now that's not quite multiplying swirl damage by 6 times, which would be really nice, but it's not. I'll put up a little calculation for you nerds of how it's factored into the damage of swirl. To put it simply, it's just adding a bunch of damage to any swirl that takes place. There's only 2 values that make a difference to this 600% swirl damage. The first is your own character's level, and the second is the enemy's resistance. This means while it is useful for characters like Mizuki, who will end up triggering big swirl numbers, and characters obviously that build full elemental mastery like Sucrose and Kazuha, maybe Venti, it's actually going to be just as effective for any character that builds no elemental mastery, so Xiao will get as much value from this as anyone else. I need to make an amendment that Xiao will be better than Kazuha or Venti for doing this, because most of their swirls happen off-field. This is all about the active character producing those swirls. This means on-field Sucrose, Xiao, Wanderer, Heizo will all make great use of the Abyss Blessing. On the second half, it's a lot simpler. We just have 75% bonus, cryo charged attack damage. But instead of going over the characters that will be really effective for, you can just look at the team building section at the end that we did last Abyss. Though this one is going to be a lot more condensed because there's a lot less conditions. As I stated in last video, we're now going to do a general tips section. This is just general useful advice for players that are struggling to get those 36 stars. The first tip is non-continuous runs. Non-continuous runs are where you don't use the same team throughout the Abyss to get 36 stars. In one run, you could get 3 stars in one chamber and no stars on the the rest of them. And then you come back and maybe next time you get 3 stars in a different chamber. And by doing this, you can get 9 stars in all of the rewards without having teams that will be able to defeat the whole Abyss all in one go. Abuse every little mechanic they give you to get all the primo gems out of Abyss. Next is enemy practice. If you're not completely sure how an enemy works, go practice them in the overworld. They might not work exactly the same, but it will still help you understand their exact mechanics. Lastly, it's about the cards that you get at the start of chambers in Abyss that give you slight buffs. These change daily and some are better for your teams than others. If you just need a little bit more damage and you're struggling on a chamber, you can wait for a different day to get a different set of cards. In fact, you can do this halfway through your run. You complete one chamber, you get to the second chamber, they give you some terrible cards, you wait till the next day, and you come back and you continue your Abyss run and you can select different cards. Right, we've got the general tips out of the way, let's get into the first chamber. As I'm adding another turn to the key I usually use, I wanted to reiterate the way in which I discuss my ideas on what's good and bad to take into chambers. We'll start off with the new term I want to add and we'll move upwards, increasing in time cost. So firstly, I'll use the term suggestion when I'm talking about something that won't necessarily improve your time, but it will make the chamber easy to complete. Whether that's by the enemy doing less damage, moving less, mechanics being easier to complete, or simply something that's a minor inconvenience. A good example of this is using Osea against a Pneuma mech. Applying Osea stops it moving as much, it removes its infusion and weakens its attacks, making it easier to hit. It doesn't actually do any damage to it or remove any resistances, so it's not technically improving your time. If I define something as a recommendation on the other hand, that means it very well likely will improve your time. But if for whatever reason you choose not to engage with that mechanic, it won't necessarily cause you to fail the chamber or at least not get all of the stars. These are also much more important to be aware of. A first good example of this is exploding the fruit against the Yumkasaur King. Doing this obviously does damage to the enemy and improves your time, but not completing this mechanic isn't a huge hazard, and maybe you have other teams that don't have Pyro or Anemo in them that just perform better or you prefer to use. Another example is bringing Cryo against the Suanni. If you don't bring Cryo against the Suanni, it does have higher resistances for 10 seconds. Not doing this mechanic doesn't necessarily mean you'll fail, and it's only 10 seconds. So while obviously it is useful to do, it's not ruining your run not to do it, especially if you have well-built characters with good artifacts. Lastly, if I list something as a requirement though, that will have a much greater effect on the time you're able to complete a chamber. These are things which if you don't meet or work around with high constellations and signature weapons on your characters, it will very likely cost you a star for the chamber. A first example of this is the Cryo Reflections for the Spirit Speaker. If you don't take Pyro Electra against these, you're left with Anemo and Geo to break the reflections. These reflections are entirely made of cryo, so you can only break them with elemental reaction, and it will slow down your run significantly if you have to do this. It's the same with not bringing the right kind of characters to break the shield of the Papilla. If you don't do that, not only are you facing big damage, but at the same time it has much higher resistances. Okay, that's everything. I hope that helps going forward. On side 1 we have 3 waves of 3 enemies, and on side 2 we have 5 waves of single target enemies. For the past 2 Abysses we haven't had much multi-wave content, but it's worth taking a moment to talk about it here. Multi-wave content is simply where you get multiple enemies spawning after each other sequentially, and the next group doesn't spawn until you've killed the previous one. Some characters are really good at dealing with this, and some have their problems. As an example, some characters that might not be great at dealing with this would be Nahida, Chlorand, and Kazuha. There you start off with the Chlorand burst, putting Electro on the enemies. Then you use Kazuha to swirl that Electro on them, reducing their resistances to all Electro damage. Next you put Nahida's skill on them to do extra damage and trigger aggravates, and then you switch to Chlorand and you shoot a single shot and the enemy dies. Now a second one spawns. Because Kazuha only swirled on that enemy that died, this enemy hasn't got reduced resistances to Electro. And the same goes for Nahida. Because they marked a particular enemy with their skill, this enemy doesn't have that mark anymore. And then Chlorand is in her skill, but you don't want to switch out of Chlorand, because if you switch out of her to reapply the debuffs and Nahida's mark, then you'll be on a really long cooldown for Chlorand's skill. Well, I'm sure this team would still do fine. Let me give you an example of a team that might do better in multi-wave content. So we'll have Farina, Neuvillette, and Gillinan. Farina starts off summoning her minions and casting her burst, giving your team extra damage and doing damage to the enemy. Then Gillinan will use her skill to reduce resistances to all nearby enemies. And lastly, Neuvillette starts using his skill and using his beam, When the first enemy dies, then not much is going to change. Farina's buff is still active and helping your characters do more damage. Her skill, her minions are still hitting the enemy. Jillian's skill is really about her and not the enemy, so she will reapply her resistance debuff to this enemy after a short moment. And lastly, Neuvlet, even if you need to switch out of him to reapply some debuffs, you can do, because Neuvlet has a really flexible rotation. Maybe you finish off using his beam and use his burst, or you just use his burst right away to get more source water droplets, letting you use his beam again. So it is worth thinking about characters you have to see if some are really good in multi-wave content versus others. So now we've taken a look at both sides generally, let's take a specific look at the first half. On the first half, we'll be facing 3 waves of 3 Eremites. These Eremites are strangely exactly the same as the Deepwood and Gilded domain. They have no summons, but they do infuse their weapons once they get down to a certain HP threshold. One is Hydro, one is Cryo, and one is Electro. And they also don't really have specific elemental resistances. The Hydro one doesn't have higher resistance to Hydro. It's in fact almost the opposite. At a certain point during the battle, they will infuse their weapons with the element that they're aligned to. After that infusion ends, they have massively reduced resistances to the element. But it's more than likely you will kill them before this. They do actually have much lower resistances to one type of damage in particular, which is physical damage. So if you want to bring a physical team, you can do, though I don't know specifically if taking advantage of that will give you any more damage than the rest of your teams. The other general tip is that there's 3 of them at a time, so grouping or multi-target damage will be good. Whether that's in the form of Kazuha or Venti to group them, or someone like Neuvlet that's more than able to blast all 3 of them at once, either one of those will be much more effective than someone like Yoimiya who's only able to hit single target enemies. There's a few notes of other mechanics, but none of them really matter significantly. The first is to watch for elemental reactions. They can quite easily freeze you if both the Cryo and the Hydro one attack with their infused attacks. And the second note is that these infusions or the weapons only happen at about 70% HP. That's about it for these Eremites. There's no summons that they have, it's just do some damage, wait for the next wave, do some damage, wait for the next wave, and then get to the next side. So side 2 is really quite contrasting to side 1. Not only do we have continuous single target enemies, so you have to defeat one before you can move on to the next, but on top of that, they're all ruin machines, which means they have naturally higher physical resistances. You've hopefully fought lots of ruin guards and ruin graders before, so they're not too difficult to deal with. As usual, if you want to shoot the ruin guard in the face or the back, you can do to disable its movement and its attacks, and the same kind of goes for the ruin grader. If you hit its feet when they're glowing or its face when it's glowing, it will do less damage and less aggressive attacks. But these are really quite simple enemies to beat. Just make sure you're bringing characters that are proficient in single target and don't rely on multi-target like a AoE Bloom team. It's just going to be very multi-wave, so do your best to deal with that. And I said this abyss was simpler, it really is. Let's take a look at Chamber 2. This is really reminiscent of old abysses. We have a lot of Churls to fight. We have some Hydro Rogue Hilichurls, some Meter Churls, and some Hilichurl Berserkers. There's going to be lots of waves of these enemies, and none of these are bosses, so grouping is going to be really effective, freeze is going to be really effective. The only higher resistance here is the Hydro Hilichurls, but even they are a limited portion of the amount of damage you need to do. So I'm not going to dissuade you from taking Hydro. 2 important things to know for this chamber are the way that the enemies spawn and the locations that they spawn in. When I say spawn, I mean as soon as you kill one wave, the next wave appears, but from this image, it's not obvious how that works. So you can kind of think of it as 2 independent groups, one with the little Berserker Hilichurls in, and one with the Hilichurl Rogues and the Meter Churls, which are the bigger ones. The little Hilichurl Berserkers have their own wave system. As soon as you defeat 2 of them, another 2 will spawn. This will keep happening until you've defeated 12 of them. Independently from this, you have the Meter Churls and the Rogue Hilichurls. For the bigger Churls, you start off with 2 Pyro Meter Churls, then you have 2 Electro Meter Churls, then 2 Rogue Hilichurls. After that, you have one of each of the Meter Churls, and then another 2 Rogue Hilichurls. It's also important to take note of the positions that they spawn in, especially for the Rogue Hilichurls. This is because the little Hilichurls and the Meter Churls are quite happy to chase you, but if you don't go near the Rogue Hilichurls, they will do ranged attacks. This means you want to go to the positions that the Rogue Hilichurls are going to spawn in before they appear. So if you have any location-based abilities like a Rosaria or an Auron Burst, you're able to hit them with it, and you don't have to spend time running over to them. The biggest thing here is that these enemies cover a very large area of the chamber. So not only is grouping useful, but being able to move around the chamber, wide hitting abilities, anything that can cover a large area will be very effective. And on the other side, we have an enemy that we've seen a few times in Abyss before, the Experimental Field Generator. This is just a single boss, so it's very single target, and this boss has really high geo resistance, so that's not recommended. There is one specific mechanic that you can prepare for against against this enemy, right at the start of the chamber it will momentarily disappear and then reappear, infusing itself with Osea. You can see this by the 3 mechanical parts in the center of it glowing that shade of purple. At the same time, it will start the gravitational field mechanic. Here it does a series of annoying attacks while allowing you to jump high in the air for free, letting you easily dodge some of the mechanics and perform plunge attacks. You can force it to exit out of this Osea phase early, making its attacks weaker and removing the gravitational field by applying 3 instances of Pneuma, the goldish version of the Pneuma Osea combo. You can see how Pneuma affects this mechanic by looking at those 3 glowing purple parts in the center change color as they're affected, and it will end this gravitational field in this mechanic once all 3 have been removed. This is a little slow to do without multiple Pneuma characters, but unless you do it this way, it will only lose its infusion after about 2 minutes. While this does make the chamber easier to fight, it might not actually be any faster because it doesn't affect the damage it takes, just the kind of attacks it's doing. The most significant mechanic to this boss is when it creates the anti-gravitational field, giving you extra jump height, and then proceeds to do shockwaves of damage. Those shockwaves do quite a lot and knock you back significantly, so it wastes a lot of time if you get hit by them. Characters like Linny might be a bit more difficult to time this up with because you want to do your charge attacks, but then you also want to jump to dodge this mechanic, so yeah, just keep it in mind and make sure to dodge those shockwaves, whether that's by dashing through them, jumping over them, iframing them, whatever you can. Okay, I think that's everything really. Let's move on to the last chamber. We're really speeding through this one, and on the first side of the last chamber, you're facing 2 sets of 2 Ruin Drakes. These are all the Earth Guards, so you don't have to worry about them flying away. They only have 1 resistance, which is a lot higher than the others, which is physical, like most machine creatures. And they have a really simple set of attacks. Grouping them is pretty easy as they're melee units and will naturally want to get close to you. I've only found 1 issue so far, which is when they perform a charge maneuver. When they're charging, they won't stop until they collide with something, be that you or the edge of the arena. And so if you can get in their way and get hit by this, do it, because it'll stop them from moving too far. The only significant mechanic you need to be aware of for them is that they have an attack much like the Aeon Blight Drake, where they stop attacking you for a short time and start absorbing the element they've taken the most damage to. If they successfully finish channeling this attack, then they gain higher resistances to said element, though this is only by 40%, so it's not that high, but it should be really easy to stop them from doing this, or stopping them after they've done it simply by shooting them in the face in any way. So you can take a bow character if you want to stop it, but there's lots of attacks in the game that can coincidentally just hit them in the face. Once you've dealt with these 2 waves, you're finally onto the last enemy of the whole abyss. Making its comeback from last abyss is the Suanni. I did go over them in my last abyss guide, but I'll do the same here. This is another single target chamber, so make sure your characters are good at that, and the Suanni naturally has higher resistances to anemo damage and hydro damage. I don't recommend taking characters that rely on either of those elements to do most of their damage. There's also 2 mechanics where they gain really high resistances. To mitigate that, you need to take cryo damage and effect elements, so pyro, hydro, electro, or cryo. So let's take a look at their mechanics. First of all, some of their attacks are hydro. This means if you infuse yourself by stunning in a Bennett burst, you're going to take a lot of damage from these attacks, so be wary of that. Once you've got it down to either 70% HP or it's performed 2 attacks, it will start its first main mechanic. There are 2 main mechanics, but it will always do them in this order. And during this time, as I said, it has really high resistances. By high, I mean up 200%. It's basically not worth doing damage during these phases if you can't stop them. Instead, take some time, dodge, and then set up to do damage as soon as this phase ends. In the first version, it infuses itself with hydro. This also removes any elements it currently has on it and stops new elements being applied apart from cryo. This is really annoying if you're playing a character like Mualani who really wants to vaporize her damage. While it's infused itself with hydro, it will do hydro attacks around the arena, and lastly do 1 big blast of hydro at the end. The way to deal with this mechanic is by freezing them first and then triggering any kind of reaction off them. You can do this by swirling them, you can melt them, you can even jump and plunge down on them to shatter. This ends a 10-second long mechanic of them having really high resistances and immobilizes them for a period of time. Though they don't have lower resistances than normal, it just brings them back to normal. When you do freeze and then immobilize the Suanni, they're knocked down for about 12 seconds before they get back up and start doing more attacks. And then once it's reached 40% HP, it will start the second mechanic. The second mechanic is an Anemo one, where it will summon 3 floating Anemo orbs around the edge of the arena. Infuse all 3 of these orbs with any kind of Fecha element, and it'll break the mechanic. This means wide range attacks like spinning with Nervlet, using a Kazar burst, using a Zhangling burst is a really easy way to break these without focusing on them, or you can just go go around and attack them individually with a catalyst user or something like with Yelan's burst active. Just like the previous mechanic, this will end their high resistances and immobilize them. Now if you don't complete this mechanic, not only is there a big instance of damage, but any of the remaining uninfused orbs turn into vortexes which will do continuous damage to you and move you around the arena, sucking you towards them. It's a real pain, but you should be able to quite easily deal with this mechanic. Lastly, occasionally throughout the fight, they may choose to do an attack where they self-infuse themselves with Hydra. If you freeze them, you can immobilize them just like with the rest of the mechanics. This means characters that apply constant amounts of cryo damage are really effective. After it's done its main mechanic, it will then do around 3 or 4 attacks and then cycle back to doing its main mechanic again, and always doing the opposite to the last version it did. So if it did Hydro, the next will be Anemo and vice versa. But that should be everything you need to know for dealing with the Suanni. And that's it. That's all the enemies this Abyss. Well, it's a lot shorter than usual, so let's go into the team section. Last time I went really in depth into the teams that I think are great, but this time there's not as many conditions, so team recommendations aren't going to be anywhere near as specific. Instead, I just want to mention the apparent characters. But before I do so, I want to remind you that all my recommendations are optional. You know, play what you want to. On top of that, if you need some kind of inspiration, there's hundreds, if not thousands of people that do amazing, incredible example runs on YouTube every single Abyss. Just search them up. In fact, just to prove that I'm not talking out my ass, I do a 4-star exclusive run every Abyss. Also, the recommendations I want to give in this section might not be the best recommendations, not the best teams to defeat it with. Most likely, that depends on your account and will be very meta teams like Moika or Adakino or Neverland. What I want to highlight is characters that are much better at doing this Abyss than they would be normally. So to do that, let's look at a continuous run, what the problems are, what the recommendations and the requirements would be. So for the whole Abyss, we have the recommendations of healers. Healers are generally good, or characters that can self-heal. We need characters that are good at dealing with multi-wave content on both sides. But that's really it for both sides. Let's look at the first half specifically. So healing, multi-wave, and multi-target is consistent across all the Abyss chambers. We're always facing at least 2 enemies, so teams that are good at making the most of that, like a Nilu Bloom team, would be good. I know I mentioned Nilu Bloom a lot when I'm talking about AoE scenarios, but they're a good example of a team that's very good at AoE content and not so good at single target content. I mean, there are variations that you can argue, but we're getting into nitty gritty there. Let's stick to the general stuff. Because it's consistently multi-target, Venti, Kazaha, Sucrose, grouping in general, Lanyan as well, right, will be useful for these chambers. Because none of the enemies that we're fighting at any point are bosses, that means all these enemies are freezable. Not only is that amazing for freeze teams, but it also means that freeze melt will work this side. And on top of all of that, we also have, obviously, the Leyline Disorder, which buffs swirl damage. There's also no real recommendations based upon elements. Sure, the first chamber has lower physical resistance, but the last chamber has higher physical resistance. And the middle chamber maybe has a bit more hydro resistance, but there's not enough enemies to say it's significant. So that's really it. This is it. This is the only suggestions we have. That means for the first time in a long time, my number one recommendation for a character that's going to excel in this Abyss more than any other character is going to be Xiao. Xiao is back, baby. Xiao makes amazing use of Farina for the constant healing and Xianyun for the constant healing in his teams. Xianyun makes him really capable in single target and very few enemies, so even against 2 enemies, you're going to be getting a lot of damage, and the nature that his burst can hit multiple enemies quite easily and his high mobility makes him just really good at all the chambers. I think if you're a Xiao player, now is the time to have fun with him. Of course, Mizuki's going to be great to this Abyss, but along those same lines, if you like playing Heiser or Sucrose, they'll also be really good. Wanderer should also be good this Abyss. He might not do quite as well because he hasn't got grouping in his kit and he doesn't have as much of a multi-target nature, but he should still be fine. And Chaska won't be very good unless you have C2 allowing you to hit multiple enemies with a lot of damage. Her single target nature is really at C0 a lot like Yoimiya, meaning these multi-target chambers might be a struggle. The only other thing I really want to hype up this Abyss that we haven't been able to use for a while is proper freeze teams. If you play Morgana and you really like that, even though the damage isn't phenomenal, they should be good this Abyss because you can freeze those small enemies, and Venti himself with the grouping is really strong. And Kokomi, who you often run in those teams, does continuous healing. But But beyond that, there's just such a vast array of teams that will do really well in this Abyss, from Hyperbloom to Nervlet. Like, you can play a lot of teams this Abyss, and it's really nice. Just anything that will do well in multi-target content, right? So, now that we've had a look at the first side, let's take a look at the second side. As before, healing is nice. We need to be able to deal with multi-wave content that we've already been over, and all the enemies continuously throughout this side are single target. We don't want to take physical because of the first chamber, we don't want to take geo because of the second chamber, and the last chamber wants us to take cryo. Cryo is also a feck element, so just take cryo. Especially when the Leyline Disorder already wants us to take cryo charge attacks. And we don't want to take Anemo or Hydro because of the Suanni. This means characters that are going to be a lot better than usual this Abyss are going to be Wriothesley, who's surprisingly on banner, and Ganyu. Ganyu is really good this Abyss. Both Melt Ganyu and Melt Wriothesley should be incredible for this Abyss. The only thing I forgot to mention was Numa, and there is one Numa character that works really well in Melt team, which is Emily. Emily is a Numa character, and she works very well with Wriothesley or Ganyu to maintain the pyro on the enemy so you can get out melts more. There are some other Numa characters you can make work in these teams. Charlotte is also Numa and a cryo character and does do charge attacks, but I wouldn't focus on building a team around the damage they do, but she does healing and continuous healing with her constellations. Linny and Farina are also characters that can apply Numa and heal themselves with their own abilities. So my biggest recommendations for this side would be some kind of cryo in your team and single target, but really beyond that you're good to go. One side is completely multi-target and the other side is completely single target, meaning so many characters can be viable this Abyss. You could very easily play Mavuika or Arlecchino just amazingly on this side, but they would be taking about as much of an advantage of this Abyss if they were running vape teams as someone like Sethos or Yanfei. So, as I said at the start of the video, make the most of this Abyss because it will be the easiest one probably for a while. Hey, welcome! You made it all the way to the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching all of that. Hope you enjoyed it and you learned a thing or two. If this helped you, sharing it, subscribing, dropping a comment saying how this helped you clear the Abyss is really helpful for me and the algorithm. Plus, I just like to see those kind of messages. But hopefully, I'll see you next time. And lastly, I did want to ask something at the end of this video. Apart from these Abyss guys, I'm not really sure what kind of other content I really want to make on this channel. If you have any ideas or any suggestions or anything you'd really like to see, let me know. Best of luck, bye bye!